Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Ghost Who Lived. Edgar Hatfield stood in his study, methodically cleaning his Glock 19, a ritual that had kept him alive through 12 years of black operations across 3 continents. The photograph on his desk showed a younger version of himself with Marlene Lloyd on their wedding day, both smiling at a future that seemed infinite. That was 15 years ago, before the agency had molded him into something that could kill without hesitation and disappear without a trace. "Dad, you're going to be late for Nate's graduation," Marlene called from downstairs, her voice carrying that familiar note of irritation that had become her default tone with him over the past 2 years. Edgar holstered the weapon beneath his jacket, old habits from a life Marlene believed he'd left behind. She knew he'd worked government security, nothing more. The nightmares, the sudden alertness at unexpected sounds, the way he could disappear into a crowd. She attributed it all to PTSD from his desk job overseas. At 22, Nate Hatfield was graduating from business school, ready to take over the family's legitimate security consulting firm that Edgar had built as cover for his real work. The boy had Edgar's sharp features but Marlene's soft heart, a combination that made Edgar both proud and concerned in a world where weakness was death. The graduation ceremony was held at the prestigious Riverside University. Edgar watched from the back row, his trained eyes automatically cataloging exits, scanning faces for threats that no longer existed in this suburban life. Marlene sat 3 rows ahead with the other proud parents, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light. She was still beautiful at 43, still the woman who'd made him want to leave the shadows and try to become human again. But something was wrong. Edgar's instincts, honed by years of survival, picked up the subtle tells. Marlene checking her phone too frequently, the nervous way she touched her wedding ring, the forced smile when she looked back at him. He'd seen the same behavior in targets who knew they were being watched. After the ceremony, they gathered at Romano's, their usual family restaurant. Nate was animated, talking about his internship at Morrison Associates, a law firm downtown. "Mr. Hickman says I have real potential," Nate said, his eyes bright with ambition. "He thinks I could make partner track within 10 years. Edgar's blood chilled. Troy Hickman, he knew that name. Not from any official channels, but from the way Marlene had started mentioning him in casual conversation over the past 6 months. Always professional, always innocent. But Edgar Hatfield had learned to read between lines written in blood. "This Hickman," Edgar said carefully, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "You trust him?" Nate nodded enthusiastically. "He's incredible, Dad. Smart, successful, and he actually listens to my ideas. Not like some of the old partners who treat interns like coffee runners." Edgar caught the slight flinch in Marlene's expression. Barely perceptible, but he'd interrogated enemies with less obvious tells. She knew something about Troy Hickman that their son didn't. That night, after Nate had gone out celebrating with friends, Edgar found Marlene in their bedroom, brushing her hair with mechanical movements. They'd once done this together, him behind her at the vanity, talking about their day, their dreams, their fears. Now, she seemed to be going through the motions of a life she no longer wanted. "You're proud of him," she said without looking at him in the mirror. "Of course." Edgar loosened his tie, watching her reflection. "Though I wonder about this mentor of his." Marlene's hand paused for just a fraction of a second. "Troy's a good man. Successful. Everything Nate could aspire to be." The way she said Troy's name, familiar, comfortable, intimate, confirmed Edgar's worst suspicions. In the intelligence world, they called it pattern recognition. In real life, they called it a husband's intuition. Edgar had spent years in places where betrayal meant death, where trust was a luxury that could get you killed. He'd survived by being paranoid, by assuming everyone was lying until proven otherwise. He'd thought that coming home, building a family, meant he could finally lower his guard. He'd been wrong. "I'm thinking of taking some time off," Edgar said, watching her reaction in the mirror. "Maybe we could take that European trip you've been wanting." "Oh." Marlene's face fell slightly. I have a lot of commitments right now. Maybe in a few months." "Commitments." Edgar almost smiled. In Chechnya, He'd broken a man's fingers one by one until he'd confessed to selling weapons to insurgents. The man had used the same word, commitments, when he tried to explain why he couldn't talk. Edgar kissed the top of Marlene's head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, mixed with an unfamiliar cologne. "Of course, love. Whenever you're ready." As Marlene slept beside him that night, Edgar stared at the ceiling and began to plan. Not the desperate, emotional planning of a betrayed husband, but the cold, methodical preparation of a Black Ops operative who'd just identified his next targets. He'd spent 15 years trying to become the man Marlene deserved. Now it was time to remember what he really was. Chapter 2: Reconnaissance and Discovery. Edgar's transformation back into operational mode was seamless and terrifying. While Marlene believed he was taking a sabbatical to find himself, he was actually conducting the most important surveillance operation of his career. The beauty of hunting your own family was that you already had access to everything. Credit card statements, phone records, daily routines, all available without breaking a single law. Edgar approached it like any other mission: identify the target, understand their patterns, find their weaknesses. Marlene's patterns had changed 6 months ago. Tuesday and Thursday book clubs that never resulted in her reading anything new. Friday evening girls' nights, where she came home smelling like expensive wine and men's cologne. Weekend shopping trips, where she bought nothing but returned glowing with a satisfaction Edgar hadn't seen in years. The burner phone was his first real piece of evidence. Edgar found it taped under her vanity drawer, a classic dead drop location. The phone contained only one number, saved under T. The text messages were carefully coded, but followed a pattern Edgar recognized from his own covert communications. The package will be delivered Tuesday at the usual location. Confirmed. The recipient will be waiting. Special delivery Friday. Higher value this time. To anyone else, it might have looked like business correspondence. But Edgar knew tradecraft when he saw it. The package was Marlene. The recipient was Troy Hickman. The deliveries were their scheduled meetings. Edgar's next step was visual confirmation. Following Marlene required skills he hadn't used since a surveillance job in Prague, but muscle memory took over. On Tuesday, he watched from a coffee shop across from the Riverside Hotel as Marlene met Troy Hickman in the lobby. Troy was exactly what Edgar had expected. Tall, distinguished, expensively dressed, with the kind of confident smile that belonged to a man who was used to taking what he wanted. He was older than Marlene, maybe 50, with silver temples and manicured hands that touched Marlene's lower back with practiced familiarity as they walked to the elevator. Edgar felt nothing as he watched them disappear. Not rage, not heartbreak, not betrayal. Those were emotions for civilians. What he felt was the cold satisfaction of a hunter who'd confirmed his prey's location. The real shock came 3 days later when Edgar decided to dig deeper into Troy Hickman's background. Using contact from his agency days, favors owed, information traded, the shadow network that never really lets you go, Edgar discovered that Troy Hickman was more than just Marlene's lover. He was Nate's biological father. The DNA records were buried deep in legal databases, accessible only to someone with Edgar's clearance level. 23 years ago, when Edgar was overseas on a classified operation, Marlene had had an affair with Troy Hickman. She'd been 3 months pregnant when Edgar returned and proposed, believing he was saving the woman he loved and the child she carried. Nate wasn't his son, had never been his son. Edgar sat in his car outside the Morrison and Associates building, watching through the glass windows as Troy Hickman put his hand on Nate's shoulder, guiding him through legal documents. Father mentoring son, neither knowing Edgar was watching, neither knowing Edgar knew. The puzzle pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. Marlene hadn't just started an affair 6 months ago. She'd rekindled an old flame. Troy Hickman hadn't just taken a professional interest in Nate. He was grooming his biological son, probably planning to reveal the truth when the time was right. The internship, the mentorship, the special attention, it was all part of a larger plan to steal Edgar's family completely. But the most devastating revelation came when Edgar hacked into Troy's personal communications. The man was sloppy with digital security, overconfident in ways that would have gotten him killed in Edgar's world. Troy's emails revealed the full scope of their betrayal. They wanted Edgar dead, not divorced, dead. Troy had hired professionals, mercenaries who specialized in making murders look like accidents. Edgar's sabbatical wasn't a coincidence. It was an opportunity. No regular schedule, no witnesses, no one to immediately notice if he disappeared. The plan was simple. Kill Edgar, make it look like a random crime or accident. Then Troy would comfort the grieving widow and stepson. After a respectable period, he proposed to Marlene, adopt Nate officially, and they'd become the perfect family they should have been 23 years ago. Edgar almost admired the elegance of it. That evening, Edgar sat at the dinner table with his wife and the son who wasn't his son, listening to Nate talk excitedly about a case Troy was letting him work on. Marlene smiled and nodded, playing the supportive mother while texting on her phone under the table, probably coordinating Edgar's murder. You know, Edgar said, cutting his steak with the same precision he'd once used to field strip weapons, I've been thinking about taking up some new hobbies. Maybe learn some new skills. That's wonderful. Honey, Marlene said without looking up from her phone. What kind of skills? Edgar smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. Oh, the kind of skills that help you solve problems. Permanently. Neither Marlene nor Nate caught the double meaning, but Edgar was no longer speaking to them as family. He was issuing a declaration of war to enemy combatants who had infiltrated his home and were planning his execution. The ghost they thought they were killing was about to become very real. And Edgar Hatfield had 15 years of very specific skills to ensure that when the body count was tallied, it wouldn't be his name on the casualty list. Chapter 3. The Perfect Storm. Edgar's first rule of operational planning was to let the enemy come to you. 2 weeks after discovering the full scope of their betrayal, he created the perfect opportunity for Troy's hired killers to make their move. He began carrying a briefcase to his morning jogs, something that would appear to contain valuable documents or cash. He established a routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he would park in the Riverside Shopping Center parking garage, level B3, ostensibly to pick up dry cleaning. The isolated location, minimal security cameras, and multiple escape routes made it a textbook kill zone. Edgar made sure Marlene knew about this routine. Pillow talk had always been her weakness. She couldn't resist sharing information when she thought it made her seem caring and attentive. Within days, Edgar's movements were being reported back to Troy through carefully coded conversations that Edgar monitored via the bugs he'd placed throughout their house. The attack came on a Thursday evening. Edgar had been expecting it, but the identities of the attackers still managed to surprise him. They weren't professional mercenaries. They were 2 local thugs, Kenny Keller and Raul Wilcox, both with extensive criminal records, but no real skill at murder. Troy had gone cheap, probably to maintain plausible deniability. Edgar parked in his usual spot on B3, then waited. His earpiece crackled with their amateur radio chatter as they positioned themselves. Keller was nervous, talking too much. Wilcox was overconfident, making rookie mistakes about cover and concealment. Targets in position, Keller whispered into his radio. You sure about this, man? Guy looks military. Just stick to the plan, came Troy's voice through Edgar's intercepted frequency. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Take the briefcase, take his wallet, leave him bleeding out. Edgar almost laughed. If these were the best killers Troy could afford, the man was even more arrogant than Edgar had estimated. They approached from both sides, a classic pincer movement that might have worked against a civilian. Edgar let them get within 10 feet before he moved. 15 years of close-quarters combat training compressed into 30 seconds of brutal efficiency. Keller went down first, Edgar's elbow connecting with his temple with precisely the right amount of force to cause unconsciousness without permanent damage. Edgar needed at least one of them alive and functional for what came next. Wilcox managed to draw a knife before Edgar's knee found his solar plexus, dropping him to the concrete, gasping for air. Edgar relieved him of the weapon and his radio, then zip-tied both men to a concrete pillar. The burner phone was in Keller's jacket pocket, exactly as Edgar had expected. When it rang, Edgar modified his voice using a technique learned from a CIA vocal coach in Langley deepening his tone and affecting a slight working-class accent. "Yeah," Edgar answered. "Is it done?" Marlene's voice was tight with nervous anticipation. Edgar's blood turned to ice water. It was one thing to know intellectually that his wife wanted him dead. It was another to hear the eager anticipation in her voice as she checked on his murder. "He put up more of a fight than expected," Edgar said, watching Keller slowly regain consciousness. "But yeah, he's gone." "Good." The relief in Marlene's voice was like a knife between Edgar's ribs. "What about the mess?" "Don't worry about it. But I'm going to need the rest of my money. And your son wants to see you too. Tonight." There was a pause. "My son?" "Nate's at the office with Troy." "Yeah. Well, seems like everyone's got questions about Daddy's accident. I'm coming to your place for the money and to have a little chat with both of you." Edgar ended the call and turned to his prisoners. Keller was awake, his eyes wide with terror. Wilcox was still struggling to breathe. "Gentlemen," Edgar said, his voice returning to its normal tone, "you've just participated in your last amateur hour. But don't worry. You're going to live long enough to learn what happens when you accept contracts on the wrong target." Edgar used Keller's own knife to cut him free, then handed the man his car keys. "You're going to drive to the police station and confess to attempted murder. You're going to tell them Troy Hickman hired you to kill Edgar Hatfield. You're going to provide them with recordings, phone numbers, and bank records. You're going to do this because the alternative is that I hunt you down and demonstrate techniques I learned in places your government doesn't officially acknowledge exist." Keller nodded frantically, clutching his bleeding scalp. "What about Raoul?" Edgar looked at Wilcox, who was slowly getting his breathing under control. "Mr. Wilcox is going to have a different assignment. You're going to call Troy Hickman and tell him that Edgar Hatfield fought back harder than expected. Tell him one of you is dead, the other is badly wounded, but the job is done. Tell him you need immediate extraction and medical attention." "Why would I do that?" Wilcox gasped. Edgar smiled, and for the first time in 15 years, it was the smile of a predator who'd cornered his prey. "Because you're going to help me deliver a message to the man who hired you. And that message is going to be written in a language he'll understand." 30 minutes later, Edgar was driving through the suburban streets toward the house where Marlene was waiting to confirm her husband's murder, where Nate was probably celebrating with his biological father, where the family Edgar had built with his own hands was about to learn what happened when you betrayed a ghost who refused to stay dead. The irony wasn't lost on him. They'd hired killers to eliminate the Edgar Hatfield who coached Little League and attended PTA meetings. Instead, they'd awakened the Edgar Hatfield who'd once eliminated an entire terrorist cell in Baghdad without leaving a single piece of evidence. As he pulled into his driveway, Edgar saw the living room lights were on. Through the window, he could make out silhouettes. Marlene pacing nervously, Troy sitting confidently in Edgar's favorite chair, Nate standing nearby with what looked like champagne glasses. They were celebrating. Edgar checked his watch. 9:47 p.m. In approximately 3 minutes, Marlene would answer the door expecting to see a hired killer bringing news of her husband's death. Instead, she would see a ghost returning home to collect a very specific kind of debt. The game was about to begin in earnest. Chapter 4. The Ghost at the Door. Edgar stood on his own front porch, finger poised over the doorbell, savoring the last moment before everything changed. Through the frosted glass, he could see movement, shadows of people who thought they were safe, who believed they'd successfully orchestrated his murder. The doorbell's chime echoed through the house like a funeral toll. Footsteps approached, Marlene's distinctive quick pace. The porch light clicked on, and Edgar positioned himself directly in its glow, ensuring she'd see his face clearly through the peephole. The locks disengaged, 2 deadbolts and a chain, installed at Edgar's insistence years ago for security. The door opened, and Marlene's face appeared in the gap, her expression transitioning from anticipation to confusion to horror in the span of a heartbeat. "Hello, darling," Edgar said, his voice carrying the same conversational tone he'd used to discuss dinner plans. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" Marlene's face went white as parchment. Behind her, Edgar could hear voices, Troy saying something about taking care of the loose ends, Nate laughing at some joke about his old man finally being out of the picture. "Edgar," Marlene's voice was barely a whisper. But you're supposed to be dead. Edgar stepped forward, forcing her to back into the foyer. Yes, I know. Funny thing about hiring amateurs for a professional job. They tend to disappoint. Edgar closed the door behind him and turned the deadbolts with deliberate clicks. The sound seemed to echo through the house like gunshots. In the living room, the conversation had stopped. Marlene, Troy's voice called out. Who was at the door? Edgar raised an eyebrow at his wife. Well, aren't you going to introduce me to your guests? Marlene's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Edgar could see her mind racing, trying to process how her dead husband was standing in their foyer, looking remarkably healthy for a man who should have been bleeding out in a parking garage. She stammered. Cat got your tongue? Edgar walked past her toward the living room, his footsteps deliberately heavy on the hardwood floor. Don't worry, love. I have quite a lot to say for all of us. Edgar entered the living room like a specter materializing at a seance. Troy Hickman was indeed sitting in Edgar's favorite leather chair, a glass of what looked like Edgar's expensive scotch in his hand. Nate stood by the fireplace, his face flushed with alcohol and excitement that was rapidly transforming into confusion. Dad, Nate's voice cracked like a teenager's. What are you doing here? We were told that I was dead, Edgar completed, moving to the bar cart and pouring himself 3 fingers of bourbon. Interesting assumption. Who exactly told you that? Troy Hickman had recovered from his initial shock and was now studying Edgar with the calculating look of a man trying to assess how much damage control would be needed. Edgar, what a pleasant surprise. We were just celebrating Nate's new promotion. Promotion? Edgar sipped his bourbon, letting the burn focus his thoughts. How thoughtful of you to celebrate my son's success in my absence. Your son, Troy repeated, his voice carrying a subtle emphasis that made Edgar's jaw tighten. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Marlene had entered the room, positioning herself between Edgar and the others, whether for protection or as a barrier. Edgar couldn't tell. I think, Edgar said finally, it's time we had an honest conversation. All of us. About family, loyalty, and the consequences of betrayal. Nate looked between the adults, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. Dad, what's going on? Why is everyone acting so strange? Edgar smiled at the young man who'd called him father for 22 years. That's an excellent question, Nate. Perhaps Mr. Hickman would like to explain why he hired Kenny Keller and Raoul Wilcox to murder me in a parking garage tonight. The accusation hit the room like a grenade. Troy's carefully maintained composure cracked for just an instant, long enough for Edgar to see the calculation behind his eyes. That's quite an accusation, Troy said smoothly. Do you have any proof of these alleged arrangements? Edgar pulled out Kenny Keller's burner phone and set on the coffee table. Would you like me to play back some of the more interesting conversations? Or perhaps we could discuss the DNA evidence that proves you're Nate's biological father. Nate dropped a champagne glass. It shattered on the hardwood, amber liquid spreading like blood. What? Surprise, Edgar said, his voice devoid of emotion. The family you thought you knew has been built on lies for 23 years. Marlene finally found her voice. Edgar, please. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Edgar's tone remained conversational, but something deadly had entered his eyes. I understand that my wife has been planning my murder. I understand that the son I raised isn't mine. I understand that you've all been celebrating my death while drinking my liquor in my house. Troy stood, his hand moving towards something inside his jacket. Edgar's bourbon glass was in his hand and flying across the room before Troy could complete the motion. It struck the lawyer in the temple with surgical precision, dropping him back into the chair, dazed but conscious. I wouldn't, Edgar advised. The next thing I throw will be considerably sharper. Nate stared at the blood trickling down Troy's face, then at Edgar, then at his mother. Mom, is it true? Is he my real father? Marlene's composure cracked completely. Nate, sweetheart, I can explain. 23 years, Edgar interrupted. 23 years of bedtime stories, birthday parties, little league games, and school plays. All for a child who was never mine. while his real father waited in the wings for the right moment to reclaim his family. Edgar walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a framed photo, the three of them at Nate's high school graduation. You know what the beautiful irony is? I would have loved him regardless. If you'd told me the truth from the beginning, I would have raised him as my own anyway. But you chose deception. You chose betrayal. You chose murder. Troy was recovering, pressing a handkerchief to his bleeding temple. Edgar, let's be reasonable here. There's no need for violence. We can work out an arrangement. An arrangement? Edgar laughed, the sound containing no humor whatsoever. Like the arrangement where you hired thugs to kill me? Like the arrangement where you've been fucking my wife while I paid for my son's education? He's not your son. Troy snapped, his composure finally shattering. He never was. Marlene was mine first, and he should have been raised as a Hickman from the beginning. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Nate made a sound like a wounded animal, staggering backward until he hit the wall. Edgar nodded slowly. There it is. The truth, finally. He turned to Marlene, who was crying silently. And you, my darling wife? Any last secrets you'd like to confess before we discuss your future arrangements? Marlene wiped her eyes, and for a moment, Edgar saw a flash of the defiance that had first attracted him to her. You were never home, Edgar. Years at a time, doing God knows what for the government. I was lonely, pregnant, and scared. Troy offered me everything you couldn't. And now you're supposed to be dead, she said quietly. We were going to be a real family. Edgar set down his bourbon and walked to the window, looking out at the suburban street where he'd once believed he could live a normal life. Here's what's going to happen, he said without turning around. Mr. Hickman is going to tell me exactly who else knows about tonight's failed operation. Then you're all going to learn what happens when you betray a man who spent 15 years perfecting the art of making problems disappear. He turned back to face them, and in that moment, they saw not Edgar the husband and father, but something far more dangerous, a predator who'd been pretending to be prey. The game has changed, Edgar continued, and I'm afraid none of you understand the rules of the game you've chosen to play. Chapter 5, Family Secrets. Edgar poured himself another bourbon while his family and their conspirators sat in stunned silence. The evening was young, and he had 23 years of lies to unravel. Let's start with you, Troy, Edgar said, settling into the chair across from the bleeding lawyer. Tell me about the plan. All of it. Troy pressed the handkerchief tighter against his temple. I don't know what you're talking about. Edgar sighed and pulled a small device from his pocket. A digital recorder no larger than a thumb drive. He pressed play, and Troy's voice filled the room. Just stick to the plan. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Take the briefcase, take his wallet, leave him bleeding out. Nate flinched as if he'd been slapped. Ew, you really try to have Dad killed? He's not your father. Troy snapped, then immediately regretted the outburst as Edgar's eyes narrowed. Biologically, no, Edgar agreed. But I'm the one who taught him to ride a bike. I'm the one who scared away the bullies. I'm the one who sat up with him when he had nightmares. What have you done for him, Troy, besides use him as a pawn in your pathetic midlife crisis? Edgar walked to his desk and pulled out a thick folder. While you were planning my murder, I was doing some research. Would you like to know what I discovered about the Hickman family legacy? Troy's face went pale. Edgar, please. Oh, this gets interesting. Edgar opened the folder and began reading. Troy Hickman, born 1975 in Detroit. Father, Mark Hickman, died in prison serving 25 to life for vehicular homicide while drunk. Mother, Desiree Hickman, overdosed on heroin when Troy was 12. Nate was staring at Troy with growing horror. You told me your parents were college professors who died in a car accident. Everyone embellishes their background, Troy said defensively. Embellishes? Edgar flipped a page. Troy spent ages 12 to 18 in foster care. 5 different homes, expelled from 3 schools for violence, arrested twice for theft before he turned 16. Edgar looked up from the file. You told my son you came from nobility, Troy. But what you really came from was white trash with a talent for violence and an even better talent for lying. Marlene spoke for the first time in minutes. Edgar, stop. You're being cruel. Cruel. Edgar turned his attention to his wife. Shall we discuss your background, darling? Or should I let Troy tell Nate about the others? What others? Nate's voice was barely a whisper. Edgar flipped to another section of the file. Your biological father has been married 4 times, Nate. Each wife was young, naive, and from a good family. Each marriage ended when Troy had extracted everything he could. Money, connections, business opportunities. Troy lunged to his feet. That's enough. Edgar didn't move, but something in his posture shifted. Sit down, Troy, before I demonstrate what I learned in Syria about pressure points. Troy sat. Wife number 1, Edgar continued, Caroline Hobbs. Married when she was 22 and Troy was 30. She inherited a small fortune from her grandfather. The marriage lasted exactly as long as it took Troy to gain access to her trust fund. Nate looked sick. Stop, please. Wife number 2, Vanessa Stokes. A judge's daughter with political connections. Troy used her father's influence to launch his legal career, then divorced her when he no longer needed the family name. Edgar closed the folder. Shall I continue? Or would you prefer to hear about wife number 3's mysterious car accident after she discovered Troy's affair with your mother? The room was dead silent. Outside, Edgar could hear the normal sounds of suburban evening. Dogs barking, cars passing, the distant laughter of children playing. Normal life continuing while his world burned down to its foundations. You're a predator, Troy, Edgar said quietly. You target vulnerable women, use them for what you need, then discard them. The only difference with Marlene is that I came home before you could complete the cycle. Troy's mask had finally slipped completely. You self-righteous bastard. You think you're better than me? You think your government murder sprees make you some kind of hero? I never claimed to be a hero, Edgar replied. But I also never targeted my own family. He turned to Nate, who was slumped against the wall, looking like he might vomit. The question now is what we do with this information. Marlene stepped forward. Edgar, I know you're angry. Angry? Edgar laughed. My dear wife, you mistake my emotional state. I'm not angry. I'm planning. Edgar walked to the fireplace and retrieved something from behind the logs, a satellite phone, military-grade, encrypted. You see, when I discovered your little conspiracy, I made some calls. Old friends, current colleagues, people who owe me favors. He held up the phone. Troy Hickman's law practice is currently being audited by the IRS, the State Bar Association, and the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Funny how many irregularities turn up when you know where to look. Troy shot to his feet again. You son of a bitch. You can't. I can, and I have. Edgar's voice remained perfectly calm. Your client trust accounts, your partnership agreements, your tax returns, everything's under review. By tomorrow morning, your law license will be suspended pending investigation. Dad, Nate said weakly, what are you doing? Edgar looked at the young man who'd called him father for 22 years. I'm teaching you a lesson about consequences, son. Actions have results. Betrayal has a price. Your biological father hired killers to murder the man who raised you. What do you think the appropriate response should be? Nate shook his head, overwhelmed. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore. Then let me explain it to you, Edgar said. In my line of work, when someone tries to kill you, there are really only 2 options. You kill them first, or you make them wish they were dead. Troy was backing toward the window, calculating distances. Edgar noticed, but didn't react. The beauty of modern surveillance, Edgar continued conversationally, is that everything leaves a trail. Bank transfers, phone calls, hotel registrations, it's all documented somewhere. Troy's hired killers are already in police custody, and they're very eager to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Edgar pulled out his regular phone and showed them a text message. Package delivered. Both recipients very talkative. Recommend proceeding to Phase 2. What's Phase 2? Marlene asked, though from her expression, she didn't really want to know. Edgar smiled, and for the first time all evening, it reached his eyes. Phase 2 is where you all learn what happens when you declare war on a man whose job description for 15 years was eliminate threats to national security. He walked to the front door and turned the deadbolts, the clicks echoing like rifle bolts chambering rounds. The house is now secure. No one leaves until we've finished our family discussion. Edgar returned to his chair and picked up his bourbon. Now then, let's talk about how this is going to end. Chapter 6. The Price of Betrayal. Edgar settled back in his chair and studied the three people who had plotted his murder. The predator in him was calculating angles, escape routes, pressure points, but the man who tried to build a family was still processing the complete destruction of everything he believed in. Here's how this works, Edgar began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to issuing orders that meant life or death. Each of you is going to tell me your part in this conspiracy. Complete truth. No omissions. No excuses. He looked at Troy first. You hired Kenny Keller and Raoul Wilcox to kill me. How did you find them? Troy dabbed at his bleeding temple. I'm not saying anything without my lawyer. Edgar laughed. Troy, you're a lawyer. And as of approximately 6 hours ago, you're also a target of multiple federal investigations. I don't think legal representation is your biggest concern right now. Edgar stood and walked to his desk, returning with a laptop. Let me show you something interesting. The screen displayed bank records, Troy's personal accounts, showing wire transfers to offshore holdings. $47,000 transferred to accounts in the Cayman Islands over the past 6 months. Money that doesn't match your declared income. Troy's face went ashen. How did you? I have friends in interesting places, Edgar said. The same friends who are currently reviewing your client trust accounts. Embezzlement is a serious charge, Troy. Even more serious when it involves funds held in trust for widows and orphans. Nate looked between them in confusion. I don't understand. Troy, you said you were successful. You said you were clean. I am successful. Troy snapped. Everything I have, I earn. Edgar flipped to another screen. This says otherwise. Client funds diverted to personal accounts, inflated billing, phantom expenses. You've been running a systematic embezzlement operation for 3 years. Edgar turned to face Troy directly. The beautiful thing about financial crimes is the paper trail. Every transaction documented, every transfer recorded. The FBI forensic accountants are going to have a field day with your books. Troy was sweating now, his earlier confidence evaporating. You set me up. I simply provided information to the appropriate authorities, Edgar corrected. Your crimes set you up. Edgar closed the laptop and returned his attention to Marlene. Your turn, darling. How long have you been planning my murder? Marlene's hands shook as she reached for a tissue. Edgar, please. I never wanted you dead. That was Troy's idea. But you went along with it. Yes. Why? The question hung in the air. Edgar could see Marlene struggling with how much truth to reveal, how much damage control was still possible. Because I was tired, she said finally. Tired of being married to a ghost. You were never really here, Edgar. Even when you were physically present, part of you was always somewhere else, thinking about classified things I couldn't know about. Edgar nodded slowly. So you decided murder was preferable to divorce. Troy said it would be easier, cleaner. No custody battles, no property disputes. Just an accident. And Nate? How long have you known Troy was his father? Marlene glanced at her son, who was staring at her with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. Always. I've always known. But you let me raise him. You wanted to. You loved him from the moment he was born. It seemed easier to let you believe he was yours. Edgar walked to the mantelpiece and picked up another framed photo. Nate's first day of school, Edgar kneeling beside him, both of them grinning at the camera. 22 years of birthdays, baseball games, parent-teacher conferences, and midnight trips to the emergency room when he broke his arm, Edgar said quietly. 22 years of being his father in every way that mattered, while his biological father was off embezzling money and planning my murder. He set the photo down and turned to Nate. And you, son? What's your role in this family drama? Nate looked like he was going to be sick. I didn't know anything, I swear. Troy offered me the internship, said I had potential. I thought he was just being nice. You thought a successful lawyer would take a personal interest in some random kid from the suburbs? Nate struggled for words. I wanted to believe I was special, that someone saw something in me worth investing in. Edgar felt something twist in his chest. Not anger, but something worse. Pity. The boy had been manipulated as much as anyone else, used as a pawn in Troy's scheme to reclaim what he saw as his rightful family. You were special, Edgar said quietly. but not because of anything Troy Hickman recognized. You're special because you've got integrity, compassion, and intelligence. Qualities you sure as hell didn't inherit from your biological father. Troy stood abruptly. I've heard enough of this. Edgar, you want to play games with financial investigations and federal charges? Fine. But remember, I know things about your past too. Black ops operations, classified missions, people who died on your orders. You think your government friends will protect you when those details become public? Edgar smiled, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Are you threatening me, Troy? I'm offering you a reality check. We can destroy each other, or we can work out an arrangement. Marlene and I disappear. You keep Nate. Everyone walks away clean. Edgar considered this for a moment. That's not a bad proposal, except for one small problem. What's that? You try to have me killed, Edgar said matter-of-factly. Not threatened, not intimidated, not blackmailed. You hired men to put bullets in my head and leave me bleeding out in a parking garage. Edgar walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful suburban street. I've spent 15 years in places where attempted murder has only one appropriate response. And that response isn't negotiation. He turned back to face them. The game ends tonight. For all of you. Troy's hand moved toward his jacket again, and this time Edgar didn't stop him. Troy pulled out a small pistol, a .32 caliber, nickel-plated, the kind of gun carried by someone who'd watched too many movies and thought he understood violence. Edgar, Troy said, his voice steadier now that he had a weapon. Step away from the door. Edgar looked at the gun with professional interest. That's a nice piece, Troy, though I notice you're holding it wrong. Finger on the trigger, stance all wrong, no sight picture. How many people have you shot with that thing? This is the first time, Troy admitted. And probably the last, Edgar said, then moved. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but felt like slow motion to everyone watching. Edgar stepped left, Troy tracked with the gun, and Edgar's right hand snapped out like a striking snake. The gun discharged once, the bullet going wide and shattering a picture frame. Then Edgar's hand closed around Troy's wrist. There was a sharp crack of breaking bone, and the gun was spinning across the floor. Troy screamed and fell to his knees, cradling his shattered wrist. Edgar retrieved the gun and examined it with professional detachment. Smith & Wesson .32, he said conversationally. 7 rounds, 1 fired, 6 remaining. Effective range about 20 feet for someone who knows how to use it. In your hands, probably effective range of about 3 feet. Edgar checked the safety and slipped the gun into his waistband. Now then, where were we? Oh yes, we were discussing appropriate responses to betrayal. Marlene was sobbing quietly. Nate was pressed against the wall in shock, and Troy was writhing on the floor, clutching his broken wrist. The thing about betrayal, Edgar continued, is that it's not just an action. It's a choice. A conscious decision to put your own interests above loyalty, above love, above the bonds that hold families together. Edgar walked to his desk and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Inside this envelope are 3 items. The first is a complete dossier on Troy Hickman's criminal activities, financial crimes, and the evidence linking him to tonight's attempted murder. The second is documentation of Marlene's complicity in the conspiracy, including phone records and digital communications. He held up the envelope. The third item is a choice. Chapter 7, The Devil's Bargain. Edgar set the manila envelope on the coffee table, like a dealer laying down the final card in a poker game, where everyone had already lost everything they could afford to lose. The choice is simple, Edgar said, returning to his chair and picking up his bourbon. Justice or mercy? Law enforcement or family resolution? Public destruction or private settlement? Troy was still on the floor, cradling his broken wrist, but his eyes were focused on Edgar with the desperate attention of a man trying to calculate odds for his survival. What do you want? Troy gasped. I want my family back, Edgar said simply. But since that's impossible, I'll settle for appropriate consequences. Edgar opened the envelope and spread 3 sets of documents across the table. Option 1. I turn everything over to federal law enforcement. Troy, you'll spend the next 15 to 20 years in federal prison for embezzlement, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 12 other charges I've managed to document. Marlene, you'll serve 5 to 7 as an accessory. He gestured to the second set of papers. Option 2. I handle this through unofficial channels. You both disappear permanently. New identities, relocation to a country without extradition treaties, but you never see Nate again, never contact him, never interfere in his life. Edgar picked up the third set of documents. Option 3. Trial by combat. Nate straightened against the wall. What does that mean? Edgar smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It means Troy and I settle this the old-fashioned way. Man to man, winner takes all. If Troy wins, everyone walks away clean. If I win... Edgar shrugged. Troy doesn't walk away at all. Marlene wiped her eyes. Edgar, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Troy hired killers to murder me. In some cultures, that gives me the right to personal vengeance. I'm offering him the chance to face me directly instead of hiding behind hired thugs. Troy struggled to his feet, still holding his shattered wrist. You're insane. I'm not fighting you. Then you choose option 1 or 2, Edgar said matter-of-factly. Prison or exile. Your call. Edgar stood and walked to a cabinet, retrieving a small metal case. Inside, nestled in foam, were 3 identical knives, military issue, balance for throwing, edges honed to surgical sharpness. If you choose trial by combat, Edgar said, the rules are simple. Each of us gets 1 knife. No other weapons, no assistance. Fight continues until one of us can't continue. Winner decides the fate of the loser. Troy looked at the knives, then at his broken wrist, then at Edgar's calm, professional demeanor. You've lost your mind. Have I? Edgar selected one of the knives and tested its balance. You try to have me murdered in a parking garage by thugs who would have shot me in the back. I'm offering you a fair fight with weapons of your choice. Which of us is the coward? Dad, Nate said quietly, this is crazy. You can't just kill people. Edgar turned to face the young man who'd been his son for 22 years. Nate, in my former line of work, I killed 37 people. Each one was someone's son, someone's father, someone's husband. I killed them because they were threats to innocent people, because they were planning atrocities, because sometimes violence is the only language certain people understand. Edgar gestured toward Troy. This man hired killers to murder me, so he could steal my family. He's embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from widows and orphans. He's used you as a pawn in his scheme to reclaim what he thinks belongs to him. Tell me, son, what's the appropriate response to that level of betrayal? Nate looked between Edgar and Troy, his face pale. I don't know. This is all insane. It's not insane, Edgar said patiently. It's justice. Raw, pure, and immediate. No lawyers, no plea bargains, no technicalities. Just consequences that match the crime. Troy was backing toward the window again, but Edgar noticed that the man was calculating, looking for weapons, escape routes, advantages. Despite his broken wrist and obvious fear, Troy Hickman was still thinking like a predator. I'll take option 2, Troy said finally. Exile. New identity, relocation. But I want guarantees. Guarantees. Edgar laughed. You're in no position to negotiate terms, Troy. I want assurance that you won't come after me later. I want your word that if I disappear, I stay disappeared with no interference from you or your government friends. Edgar considered this. And in exchange, I give up all claim to Nate. No contact, no future attempts to build a relationship. He stays your son, legally and in every other way. Edgar looked at Nate, whose face showed a mixture of relief and loss. The boy was losing a biological father he'd just discovered, but gaining the certainty that the man who'd raised him would remain in his life. What about Marlene? Edgar asked. Troy's face hardened. She makes her own choice. I'm not negotiating for anyone but myself. The statement hit the room like a physical blow. Marlene stared at Troy in shock, realizing that the man she'd betrayed her husband for was abandoning her the moment his own survival was threatened. So much for true love, Edgar observed. Marlene, it appears your paramour is willing to sacrifice you to save his own skin. How does that make you feel about your life choices? Marlene sank into a chair, the full weight of her situation finally hitting her. What happens to me? Edgar walked to the window and looked out at the street where he'd once believed he could live a normal life. 2 police cars were parked at the curb, their occupants waiting for his signal. That depends on what you choose, Marlene. Option 1 means federal prison. Option 2 means permanent exile with a man who just demonstrated he'll abandon you the moment it's convenient. Option 3. Edgar turned back to face her. Option 3 is that you choose to end this yourself. The room went silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The same clock that had marked time through 23 years of birthday parties, anniversaries, and family dinners. What do you mean? Marlene whispered. Edgar returned to his desk and pulled out a small pill bottle. Potassium cyanide. Military grade, fast-acting, relatively painless. You take responsibility for your actions, and Nate is spared the trauma of watching his mother go to prison for attempting to murder his father. Nate shot to his feet. Dad, no. You can't ask her to. She's my mother. She's the woman who carried you for 9 months and then spent 23 years lying to both of us about who your real father was, Edgar corrected. She's the woman who conspired to have me murdered so she could play house with her old lover. She's the woman who was celebrating my death while drinking my liquor in my house. Edgar set the pill bottle on the table next to the other options. But you're right. She's also your mother. So the choice is hers. Marlene stared at the 3 options spread before her. Federal prison, exile with a man who'd already betrayed her, or death by her own hand. I need time to think, she said finally. You have until sunrise, Edgar replied. After that, I turn everything over to federal law enforcement, and the choice is out of your hands. Edgar checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. That gives you about 6 hours to decide how you want this story to end. He walked to the front door and turned the deadbolts. No one leaves until the choice is made. We're all going to sit here together as a family and see this through to its conclusion. Edgar returned to his chair and poured himself another bourbon. After all, we've got quite a lot to discuss. 23 years of lies to sort through, relationships to redefine, consequences to accept. He raised his glass in a mock toast to family loyalty and the price of betrayal. Outside, the suburban street remained peaceful, unaware that inside one perfectly normal-looking house, 3 people were choosing between their last options for survival. Chapter 8. The morning after. Dawn crept through the windows of the Hatfield house like an unwelcome witness to the night's revelations. Edgar had remained awake throughout the long hours, watching his family make their choices while nursing the same glass of bourbon and calculating the precise choreography of consequences. Troy had been the first to break. At 3:17 a.m., he'd formally requested option 2, exile with a new identity. Edgar had made the arrangements with a single encrypted phone call to contacts who specialized in making people disappear completely. A car will pick you up at 6 a.m., Edgar had told him. You'll be driven to a private airfield, flown to Vancouver, then transported to a location that will remain undisclosed. Your new identity documents will be waiting, along with enough money to start over. Troy had nodded, cradling his broken wrist. And if I ever try to contact Nate, then you'll discover that exile was the merciful option, Edgar had replied. Marlene had spent the night staring at the 3 choices, occasionally picking up the pill bottle, then setting it down again. Nate sat beside her, holding her hand, both of them looking like survivors of a shipwreck waiting for rescue that would never come. At 5:30 a.m., as the first pale light began filtering through the curtains, Marlene finally spoke. I choose option 1, she said quietly. Federal prison. Edgar looked up from the financial records he'd been reviewing. Why? Because I want to live, Marlene said. I want the chance to someday earn Nate's forgiveness, even if I never earn yours. I want to serve my time and come home to whatever family I have left. Edgar nodded slowly. That's a brave choice. Stupid but brave. He stood and walked to the window, watching as a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Troy, your ride is here. Troy struggled to his feet, his face pale from pain and exhaustion. He looked at Nate, opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Smart choice, Edgar said. There's nothing you could say that would make any of this better. Troy walked toward the door, then turned back. Edgar, for what it's worth, I never wanted anyone to get hurt. Edgar smiled, and for the first time in hours, it was genuine. Of course you did, Troy. You wanted me hurt badly enough to hire killers. You wanted my family hurt badly enough to destroy everything they believed about themselves. You just didn't want to do the hurting personally. Edgar opened the door. That's the difference between a predator and a killer. A predator destroys from a distance. A killer takes responsibility for the damage. Troy walked out of the house and climbed into the waiting sedan. Edgar watched through the window as the car disappeared down the suburban street, carrying away the man who tried to steal his life. At 6 a.m. sharp, Edgar made another phone call. 15 minutes later, 2 FBI agents arrived at the front door. A man and woman in dark suits, carrying briefcases and wearing the kind of neutral expressions that came from years of arresting people in their bathrobes. Mrs. Hatfield, the female agent said, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." As they read Marlene her rights and fitted her with handcuffs, Edgar watched Nate's face carefully. The young man was crying silently, but there was something else in his expression, relief, maybe, or acceptance that this was how the story had to end. "Can I say goodbye?" Nate asked. The agents looked at Edgar, who nodded. Nate hugged his mother carefully, mindful of the handcuffs. "I'll visit you," he whispered. "I promise." Marlene kissed his cheek. "I love you, baby. I'm sorry for everything." Then she was gone, escorted to a federal courthouse where she would face charges that would likely send her to prison for the better part of a decade. Edgar and Nate stood in the foyer of the house that had once been home to a family built on lies. The silence stretched between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. "So," Nate said finally, "what happens now?" Edgar walked to the living room and began collecting the scattered documents, the broken glass, the evidence of the night's revelations. "Now you have choices to make." "What kind of choices?" Edgar looked at the young man who'd called him father for 22 years. "You can stay or go. You can keep the name Hatfield or change it to Hickman. You can continue to think of me as your father or cut all ties and start fresh." Nate sat heavily in the chair where Troy had been sitting hours earlier. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to choose based on what's best for you, not on what you think I want to hear." Edgar finished collecting the papers and documents, sealing them in a box that would go into his safe. "For what it's worth, Nate, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Biology doesn't change that. What your mother and Troy did doesn't change that." Nate wiped his eyes. "I don't know how to process any of this. Yesterday, I thought I knew who I was, who my family was, what my life was going to look like. Now everything's different." "Everything was always different," Edgar said gently. "You just didn't know it yet." Edgar sat across from Nate in the chair where he'd spent so many evenings reading bedtime stories, helping with homework, listening to teenage problems that had seemed so important at the time. "Here's what I know about you, son, and you are my son, regardless of DNA. You're honest, intelligent, compassionate, and strong. You got those qualities from the choices you made, not from the genetics you inherited. Troy Hickman never could have raised the man you've become." Nate looked around the living room, his eyes settling on the family photos that now seemed like artifact from someone else's life. "What about you? What are you going to do?" Edgar considered the question. "I'm going to clean up the mess that's left. Make sure Troy Hickman truly disappears. Make sure your mother has competent legal representation. Make sure the people who helped me tonight understand that this matter is closed permanently. And then I'm going to figure out how to be Edgar Hatfield without being anyone's husband. But if you'll let me, I'd like to keep being your father." Nate nodded slowly. "I'd like that too." They sat in comfortable silence as the morning sun filled the room with light that seemed to wash away the shadows of the previous night. Outside, the suburban street was coming alive with the normal rhythms of daily life. Garbage trucks, dog walkers, children heading to school. "Dad," Nate said finally. "Yeah. What you did last night, giving them choices instead of just turning them over to the police, was that mercy or revenge?" Edgar smiled. "Sometimes, son, the two things are the same." Chapter 9. New Foundations. 6 months later, Edgar stood in the kitchen of the same house, preparing breakfast for two. The morning routine had become sacred. Coffee, eggs, toast, and the kind of comfortable conversation that develops between two people who've survived a catastrophe together. Nate came downstairs wearing a suit and tie, looking every inch the young professional he'd become. After Troy's disappearance and the collapse of Morrison and Associates, Nate had taken a position with a competing firm, one with sterling ethical credentials and no connection to his biological father's criminal activities. "Big day today?" Edgar asked, sliding a plate of eggs across the counter. "Settlement conference on the Morrison bankruptcy case," Nate said, accepting the coffee Edgar offered. "Ironic that I'm helping to clean up the mess left by Troy." Edgar noticed the hesitation, the way Nate still struggled with how to refer to the man who'd been his biological father, mentor, and would-be destroyer all at once. "How are the victims being compensated?" "About 60 cents on the dollar," Nate said. "Not perfect, but better than losing everything." The federal seizure of Troy's offshore accounts helped recover more than anyone expected. Edgar nodded. His contacts had ensured that every piece of Troy Hickman's financial empire was discovered and liquidated for victim compensation. It was, Edgar thought, the least he could do for the widows and orphans Troy had robbed. "Any word from your mother?" Nate's expression tightened slightly. "She calls once a week. She's adjusting to prison life. Says she's taking education classes, trying to make the best of it." Marlene Hatfield was serving a 7-year sentence at a minimum security federal facility in Pennsylvania. She'd pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and full cooperation with the investigation into Troy's financial crimes. "Do you plan to visit her?" "Eventually," Nate said. "When I'm ready. Right now, I'm still processing everything." Edgar understood. The boy, man, really, was rebuilding his identity from the ground up, trying to figure out who he was when everything he believed about his origins had been stripped away. Edgar's phone buzzed with a text message from an encrypted number. "Package permanently delivered to requested coordinates. No return receipt required." Edgar deleted the message without responding. Troy Hickman's new identity had lasted exactly 3 months before he'd made the mistake of trying to contact Nate through social media. Edgar's associates had handled the problem with their characteristic efficiency. "Dad," Nate was looking at him with concern. "Everything okay?" "Just work," Edgar said, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "Some problems require permanent solutions." Nate nodded, accepting the vague explanation. He learned not to ask too many questions about Edgar's consulting work, just as Edgar had learned not to volunteer information that might burden his son with knowledge he didn't need. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, two men who'd been through hell together and emerged with a stronger bond than biology or legal documents could ever provide. "I've been thinking," Nate said as he prepared to leave for work, "about changing my name legally, making Hatfield official instead of just the name I grew up with." Edgar felt something warm and unexpected in his chest. "You don't have to do that for me, son." "I'm not doing it for you," Nate said. "I'm doing it for me. Edgar Hatfield is my father. Has been since I was born, will be until one of us dies. DNA doesn't change that." Edgar nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Nate paused at the door. "Also, I was thinking about Thanksgiving. I know it'll just be the two of us, but maybe we could try to make it feel like family." "We are family," Edgar said simply. "We always have been." After Nate left for work, Edgar walked through the house that had once been home to a family built on lies and was now home to a family built on choice. He'd removed most of the photos that included Marlene, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Some wounds needed clean air to heal properly. The basement had been converted into an office where Edgar ran his legitimate security consulting business, advising corporations and government agencies on threat assessment and personnel protection. It was satisfying work that used his skills without requiring him to kill anyone or disappear into shadows. At 10 a.m., Edgar's secure phone rang. A client with a kidnapping situation in Colombia that required immediate consultation. Edgar listened to the details, quoted his fee, and began planning another trip back into the world he'd once left behind. But this time, he'd be coming home. Not to a wife who was planning his murder or a son who didn't know his real parentage, but to a family he'd chosen and who'd chosen him in return. Edgar looked at the calendar on his desk, counting the days until Thanksgiving. He made a mental note to buy a smaller turkey this year. just enough for two men who'd learned that the size of a family matters less than the strength of its foundations. As he prepared for another mission in another country where people paid him to solve problems that required his particular set of skills, Edgar reflected on the strange justice of his situation. Troy Hickman was dead, buried in an unmarked grave in a country whose name would never appear on any official records. Marlene was serving her sentence, learning that actions have consequences even for suburban mothers who think they're above the law. And Nate was building a life based on truth instead of comfortable lies. Edgar had lost a wife and gained a son. He'd discovered that his family was built on deception and rebuilt it on honesty. He'd faced betrayal and responded with the kind of ruthless efficiency that had kept him alive through 15 years of black operations. In the end, Edgar thought as he packed his gear for Colombia, it had been a fair trade. Family, real family, was worth any price, even the price of becoming a ghost who refused to stay dead. The story of Edgar Hatfield was far from over, but the chapter about betrayal and revenge had finally closed, and the next chapter would be written by two men who'd chosen each other when DNA and marriage certificates had failed them. Sometimes, Edgar reflected, the families you choose are stronger than the ones you're born into. And sometimes, the only way to save a family is to destroy everything fake about it and rebuild from the ground up. As Edgar locked his house and headed for the airport, he carried with him the satisfaction of a man who'd faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged victorious. Not because he destroyed his enemies, but because he discovered what was truly worth fighting for. Family, truth, and the kind of loyalty that could only be earned, never inherited. The ghost had found his way home at last.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.